The blue lights on the control panel blinked faster than usual. Captain Jake Morrison leaned back in his chair and rubbed his tired eyes. 3 months in deep space had worn him down more than he wanted to admit. The exploration ship New Horizon drifted silently through the dark void between stars, running routine scans of empty space that seemed to stretch forever in all directions. Jake watched the stars through the main window and wondered if Earth felt as far away to his crew as it did to him. His wife Kate would be getting ready for workabout now, assuming he had calculated the time difference correctly. His daughter Emma would be at school, probably forgetting to eat her lunch again. The thought made him smile despite his exhaustion. The communication system made a sharp beep that cut through his thoughts like a knife. Jake sat up straight. They had been out of contact with other ships for weeks. Any message reaching them, this far from civilization, meant something important was happening. "Captain Morrison to the bridge," came the voice of his communications officer, Lieutenant Dan Phillips. The urgency in his voice made Jake move faster than he had in days. Jake found Phillips staring at his screen with a confused expression. The rest of the bridge crew had gathered around him, all looking equally puzzled. Commander Lisa Grant turned when Jake entered. "Sir, we received a transmission about 20 minutes ago. It took this long to decode because it came through channels we have never seen before," she said. Jake walked over to Phillips. "What kind of transmission?" Phillips touched his screen and the message appeared. The text was in perfect English, but the format looked nothing like any human communication Jake had ever seen. Strange symbols decorated the borders, and the letters seemed to shimmer with their own light. "Captain Morrison of the human vessel New Horizon," Jake read aloud. "The High Council of Korvax Prime extends an invitation to your species to participate in the 1,000-year trial of worthiness. Your champion will join representatives from 12 galactic civilizations in combat trials that determine trade, rights, territorial claims, and standing among the stars. The trials begin in 30 standard days. Respond within 10 days if humanity accepts this honor." Jake read the message 3 times before the words sank in. The bridge fell silent except for the quiet hum of the ship's engines. Chief Engineer Pete Collins broke the silence first. "Captain, did aliens just invite us to some kind of fighting tournament?" "That appears to be exactly what happened," Jake replied, still staring at the message. Commander Grant stepped closer. "Sir, this has to be some kind of joke. We have had contact with exactly 3 alien species in 50 years of space travel. None of them mentioned anything about trials or tournaments." Jake knew she was right to be suspicious. Since humans had developed faster than light travel, their encounters with alien life had been brief and cautious. The few species they had met treated humans like curious children who had just learned to walk. The idea that these same aliens would invite humanity to compete in something this important made no sense. "Phillips, can you trace where this message came from?" Jake asked. "Already tried, sir. The signal originated from a system about 2 weeks away at maximum speed. According to our star charts, there are 3 planets in that system, but we have no information about who lives there." Jake walked to the main window and looked out at the stars. Somewhere out there, alien civilizations were preparing their greatest fighters for trials that could change humanity's future. The message had mentioned 12 species. Jake tried to imagine what kind of beings would be strong enough to represent entire civilizations in combat. "Grant, what do you think?" Jake asked without turning around. She joined him at the window. "I think it sounds like a trap, sir. Why would they want us there? We are barely 50 years into space travel. Most of these alien civilizations have probably been exploring the galaxy for thousands of years." Pete Collins cleared his throat. "With respect to Commander Grant, maybe that's exactly why they want us there. Think about it. If this tournament has been going on for 1,000 years, maybe they need some new competition. Maybe they are bored. Or maybe they want to make an example of us." Grant replied. "Show the galaxy what happens to upstart species who think they can play with the big boys." Jake considered both possibilities. Either scenario meant humanity was about to face something they had never encountered before. The question was whether they should face it or run from it. "Phillips, send a message to Earth Command. Full details about this transmission. Ask for instructions and recommendations," Jake ordered. "Yes, sir. Should I mention that you are considering accepting?" Jake turned to face his crew. I have not decided anything yet, but I want Earth to know what we are dealing with. Over the next 3 days, Jake barely slept. Messages flew back and forth between the New Horizon and Earth. Politicians argued about the risks. Military advisors questioned the motives behind the invitation. Scientists wanted to study every word of the alien message for hidden meanings. Jake found himself thinking about his daughter Emma. She was 8 years old and fascinated by stories of knights and dragons. She would ask him to tell her about brave heroes who fought monsters to protect their kingdoms. In those stories, the hero always accepted the challenge, no matter how dangerous it seemed. But this was not a story. This was real, and the stakes were higher than any fairy tale. If Jake failed, humanity might lose access to trade routes they did not even know existed yet. If Jake succeeded, humanity might finally earn respect among the stars. On the 4th day, Earth Command sent their decision. The message was short and direct. Captain Morrison has full authority to accept or decline on behalf of humanity. Earth Command supports whatever decision he makes. Jake stared at the message for a long time. They were leaving the choice to him. Jake stood at the window of the transport shuttle and watched Korvax Prime grow larger as they approached. The planet looked like a giant blue marble covered in silver lines that sparkled in the sunlight. Those lines were cities, the pilot had explained, each one home to millions of beings from across the galaxy. The shuttle was twice the size of any human spacecraft Jake had ever seen, but the alien pilot treated it like a simple taxi. 3 other passengers sat in the back section, but Jake could not see them clearly through the tinted barrier that separated the sections. He caught glimpses of shapes that did not look remotely human. First time to Korvax Prime? The pilot asked without turning around. His voice came through a translator device that made him sound like he was speaking through water. First time anywhere like this, Jake replied honestly. The pilot made a sound that might have been laughter. You are the human champion. I heard about you on the news feeds. Most people are betting you will not survive the first day. Jake felt his stomach tighten. What kind of odds are they giving? Let me put it this way. If you win the whole tournament, anyone who bet on you will become very rich. The shuttle landed at a spaceport that stretched beyond the horizon. Jake counted at least 50 different types of spacecraft on the landing pads. Some looked like metal birds with wings that glowed with their own light. Others were perfect spheres that floated inches above the ground. A few were so strange that Jake could not figure out which end was the front. Jake gathered his single bag and stepped off the shuttle. The gravity on Korvax Prime felt slightly heavier than Earth, and the air had a sharp taste that made his nose itch. The spaceport buzzed with activity as beings of all shapes and sizes moved between ships and buildings. A tall figure approached him from the crowd. It walked on 2 legs like a human, but stood at least 8 feet tall. Its skin was covered in blue scales that shifted color as it moved. When it spoke, Jake could see rows of sharp teeth. Captain Morrison, I am Velkoth, your assigned guide. The High Council sent me to escort you to the arena complex. Jake shook hands with Velkoth, trying not to wince at the creature's grip. Thank you for meeting me. I have to admit I am not sure what I expected, but this place is incredible. Korvax Prime has served as the neutral meeting ground for galactic civilizations for over 2,000 years. The arena complex is the oldest part of the city. You will be staying there until the trials are complete. They walked through the spaceport toward a line of vehicles that looked like metal eggs with windows. Velkoth explained that these were called transit pods and could travel anywhere in the city in minutes. As they traveled, Jake pressed his face to the window and stared at the sights outside. Buildings rose from the ground like crystalline trees, their surfaces reflecting light in patterns that hurt to look at directly. Flying vehicles moved between the buildings in organized streams, never seeming to collide despite their speed. The other champions arrived days ago, Velkoth said. They have been training in the arena's preparation facilities. You will meet them at tonight's opening ceremony. What can you tell me about them? Velkoth's scales shifted to a darker blue. Thrak the Destroyer represents the Saurian Empire. He has won 17 single combat tournaments and has never been defeated. His people are natural warriors who begin fighting training before they can walk properly. Jake nodded, trying to hide his nervousness. Anyone else I should know about? Vex 9 from the Mechanoid Collective. He is not born, but built. His body can be modified for any type of combat. He has backup memory cores, so even if you destroy his body, his mind survives. The transit pod slowed as they approached a massive structure that dominated the city center. The arena looked like a combination of a stadium and a fortress with walls that seemed to be made of living crystal. Jake could see thousands of beings gathered outside its entrance. And there is whisper of death from the ethereal brotherhood, Velkoth continued. She can read minds and move objects with her thoughts. Some say she can kill with a single focused thought. Jake felt sweat forming on his forehead despite the cool air in the pod. These all sound like beings who were designed for fighting. What about the others? There are 9 more champions, each representing civilizations that have mastered different aspects of warfare. The Skyborn Empire sent their greatest aerial fighter. The Deep Ones chose their most skilled underwater warrior. The Hive Mind selected their most intelligent drone. The pod stopped at the arena's main entrance. Jake stepped out and looked up at the towering walls. Somewhere inside this structure, he would soon face beings who could kill him in ways he could not even imagine. Captain Morrison, Velkoth said as they walked toward the entrance. May I ask you something? Of course. Why did your people send you? Your species has no reputation for warfare. You have no special abilities that we know of. You are not even particularly large or strong compared to the other champions. Jake stopped walking and considered the question. It was something he had been asking himself since accepting the invitation. I think, Jake said slowly, they sent me because I am willing to try. Sometimes that is enough. Velkoth's scales rippled with what might have been amusement. We shall see, Captain Morrison. We shall see. They entered the arena complex through doors that were 30 feet tall and covered in carvings that seemed to move when Jake was not looking directly at them. The interior was even more impressive than the outside, with corridors that stretched in impossible directions and rooms that defied basic physics. Jake's quarters were simple but comfortable: a bed, a desk, and a window that looked out over the city. On the desk was a thick book written in several languages, including English. The title read, Rules and Regulations for the Trial of Worthiness. Jake opened the book and began to read. Tomorrow the trials would begin, and he needed to understand exactly what he had gotten himself into. Jake woke to the sound of a loud horn echoing through the arena complex. He had barely slept, spending most of the night reading about the trials and trying to understand what he would face. The rules book was thick and complicated, written in legal language that made his head hurt. He dressed quickly and stepped into the hallway. Other champions were already moving toward the main arena chamber. Jake caught his first clear look at the beings he would compete against and his heart sank. Thrak the Destroyer was even more intimidating in person. The Saurian stood nearly 9 feet tall, covered in thick green scales that looked like natural armor. His arms were as thick as tree trunks and his claws could probably cut through steel. He moved with the confidence of someone who had never lost a fight. Vex 9 glided past on mechanical legs that made no sound against the floor. The mechanoid's body was a work of art and engineering, with parts that shifted and rearranged themselves as Jake watched. Red lights blinked where eyes should be, and Jake could hear the quiet hum of internal machinery. Whisper of Death was the most unsettling of all. She looked almost human from a distance, but as she came closer, Jake could see that her skin was translucent and seemed to glow with pale light. She turned to look at him, and for a moment Jake felt something cold touch his mind before she looked away. The other champions were equally impressive. A being made of what looked like living metal walked beside a creature that seemed to be made entirely of compressed air and lightning. Jake felt like a child who had wandered into a meeting of gods. They entered the main arena, and Jake stopped breathing for a moment. The space was enormous, easily large enough to hold a small city. The walls rose up in tiers filled with thousands of spectators, representing dozens of different species. The noise was overwhelming, as voices, roars, clicks, and sounds Jake could not identify blended together. In the center of the arena floor stood a platform where 12 robed figures waited. Jake recognized them as the High Council members who would judge the trials. Behind them, The arena floor was empty except for strange markings carved into the ground. "Champions," called the central figure in a voice that somehow reached every corner of the arena without shouting. "Welcome to the 1,000-year trial of worthiness. Today begins the test of environments. You will face 5 different challenges as the arena transforms around you. Those who survive all 5 will advance to the next trial." Jake looked around at his fellow champions. Most of them seemed calm and confident. A few were stretching or checking their equipment. Jake had no equipment except the simple clothes he wore and a small knife his grandfather had given him years ago. "The first environment begins now," the council member announced. The arena floor suddenly began to change. The stone dissolved away and was replaced by burning sand. The temperature jumped from comfortable to blazing hot in seconds. Jake felt the heat hit him like a physical blow, and sweat began pouring down his face immediately. Above them, an artificial sun blazed with intensity that made it painful to look up. There was no shade anywhere in the arena, just endless desert stretching in all directions. Jake could see heat waves rising from the sand, distorting everything in the distance. Thrak. The destroyer seemed completely unaffected by the heat. His species came from a desert world, and this environment was probably comfortable for him. He stood in the center of the arena with his arms crossed, waiting for whatever came next. Vex 9 made adjustments to his mechanical body. Cooling vents opened along his sides and his outer shell changed color to reflect more light. Within minutes, he had adapted perfectly to the desert conditions. Other champions used different strategies. One wrapped itself in some kind of energy field that kept the heat away. Another seemed to absorb the heat and grow stronger from it. A third champion created a small cloud above its head that provided shade and cool air. Jake had no special abilities and no technology to help him. He did what humans had done for thousands of years when faced with hostile environments. He started thinking. The arena had to have some kind of water source. Even artificial deserts needed water for the systems that created them. Jake began walking along the edge of the arena, ignoring the burning sand under his feet. He looked for any sign of moisture or cooling systems. Near the north wall, Jake found what he was looking for. A small section of the wall was slightly cooler than the rest, and when he pressed his ear against it, he could hear the sound of moving water. The arena's cooling systems had to be somewhere behind this wall. Jake used his knife to dig around the base of the wall section. The sand was looser here, and after a few minutes of careful digging, he found a small drainage grate. Cool air flowed through the openings, and Jake could see water moving in pipes beneath. He took off his shirt and wrapped it around the grate, then poured sand over it. The shirt absorbed moisture from the cooling system, and the sand helped insulate it from the heat above. Jake had created a simple but effective way to stay cool and hydrated. Other champions watched him with curiosity. They had expected the human to collapse from heat exhaustion within minutes, but instead he had found a way to survive using nothing but basic tools and thinking. The desert environment lasted for 30 minutes before the arena began changing again. The sand turned to ice and the blazing sun disappeared, replaced by howling wind and freezing snow. The temperature dropped so fast that Jake could see his breath immediately. Now the champions who had been comfortable in the desert struggled with the cold. But Jake was ready. He had torn strips from his shirt while in the desert and soaked them with the cool water he had found. Now he wrapped these strips around his hands and feet to prevent frostbite. He gathered pieces of debris that had fallen from the arena walls during the transformation and built a small windbreak. Then he used his knife to scrape metal filings from a damaged section of the wall and created sparks to start a small fire using fabric from his clothes. The fire was tiny, but it provided just enough warmth to keep Jake alive in the freezing environment. Other champions stared at him in amazement. The primitive human was not just surviving, but finding creative solutions to each challenge. The arena transformed again before Jake could catch his breath. The ice and snow melted away instantly, replaced by deep water that rose up to his chest. The artificial sky above turned dark gray, and Jake could hear the sound of waves crashing against invisible shores in the distance. Jake treaded water and looked around. Several champions were already having trouble. The being made of compressed air and lightning began to flicker and fade as the water interfered with its energy form. One of the mechanical champions sparked and sank beneath the surface, its systems failing in the water. Thrak the destroyer was struggling too. His heavy body and thick armor were not designed for swimming. He thrashed in the water, trying to stay afloat through brute strength alone. Jake could see panic in the large warrior's eyes for the first time. Other champions adapted quickly. A sleek blue creature that looked like a giant fish moved through the water with perfect ease. The translucent whisper of death seemed to float on the surface without effort, probably using her mental powers to support herself. Jake had learned to swim as a child in the lakes near his hometown. The water in the arena was warm and clear, much easier to handle than the cold mountain lakes he remembered. He floated on his back to conserve energy and studied his surroundings. The water environment would not last forever. Jake needed to be ready for whatever came next. He noticed that pieces of debris from the previous environments were floating in the water around him. Ice chunks from the frozen wasteland, charred metal from his small fire, and fragments of stone from the original arena floor. Jake began collecting these pieces, tying them together with strips of cloth from his torn shirt. He created a small floating platform that could support some of his weight. It was not much, but it would help him save energy for the challenges ahead. The water began to drain away after 20 minutes, revealing a new environment that made Jake's stomach turn. The arena floor was now covered in thick, bubbling swamp water that gave off toxic green fumes. Strange plants with thorns the size of daggers grew from the murky ground. The air itself seemed poisonous, making Jake's eyes water and his throat burn. 3 more champions collapsed immediately as the toxic fumes hit them. Their bodies were not designed to handle this kind of chemical warfare. Jake watched them fall and felt a mix of relief and horror. Relief that he was still standing. Horror that beings who had seemed so powerful could be defeated so easily. Jake pulled the remains of his shirt up over his nose and mouth, creating a basic filter for the poisonous air. It was not perfect, but it helped reduce the burning in his lungs. He had seen pictures of old battlefields on Earth where soldiers used similar techniques to survive gas attacks. Moving carefully through the swamp, Jake avoided the larger plants and deeper pools of toxic water. He noticed that some areas had slightly cleaner air, usually where small air currents moved between the deadly plants. Jake followed these air paths, using them like roads through the poisonous maze. Vex 9 had sealed his mechanical body completely and was moving through the swamp like a submarine. His artificial systems did not need to breathe, giving him a huge advantage in this environment. Whisper of Death seemed to be creating a bubble of clean air around herself with her mental powers. Jake had no special abilities, but he had something else. He had grown up on a farm where his grandfather taught him about plants and natural chemistry. Some of the swamp plants looked familiar, similar to species he had seen on Earth. If he was right about what they were, Jake might be able to use them to his advantage. He carefully approached a cluster of broad-leafed plants that grew near the edge of the toxic pools. Their leaves were thick and waxy, designed to protect the plant from the poisonous environment. Jake cut several leaves with his knife and pressed them together, creating a better breathing mask than his torn shirt. The plant leaves filtered the air much more effectively. Jake could breathe more easily and think more clearly. He used this advantage to study the swamp environment more carefully, looking for patterns and weaknesses. Near the center of the arena, Jake noticed something interesting. The toxic fumes were thickest around certain areas, but they moved in predictable patterns, based on air currents generated by the arena's systems. If Jake timed his movements correctly, he could use these patterns to reach cleaner areas. Jake began moving in a zigzag pattern, following the flow of cleaner air between the worst toxic zones. It took longer than walking straight, but it kept him alive and alert while other champions struggled with the poisonous atmosphere. The swamp environment lasted the longest of any challenge so far. By the time it began to change, only 7 champions remained standing. Jake was exhausted but still conscious, still thinking, still adapting. The final environment hit them like a physical blow. The arena became a zero-gravity void filled with floating rocks and metal debris. There was no air to breathe and no gravity to provide direction. Jake found himself spinning helplessly in empty space, fighting panic as his lungs burned for oxygen. This was the environment that would separate the survivors from the truly exceptional. Jake had maybe 2 minutes of consciousness before lack of oxygen would cause him to pass out. He needed to find air fast, or his journey would end here. Jake spotted something that gave him hope. Some of the floating debris looked like pieces of equipment from the arena's systems. If he was lucky, some of those pieces might contain emergency air supplies or life support systems. Using his momentum from the environmental change, Jake pushed off from a floating rock and launched himself toward the largest piece of debris. His lungs screamed for air and his vision began to blur around the edges. Jake reached the debris with seconds to spare and found what he was looking for. Built into the side of the metal fragment was an emergency air tank, probably part of the safety systems that protected arena workers during maintenance. Jake pressed his face to the breathing mask and took deep, grateful breaths of clean oxygen. Around him, other champions were finding their own solutions to the airless environment. But Jake had proven something important to the watching crowd. The human was not just lucky. He was resourceful, adaptable, and determined to survive no matter what the arena threw at him. Jake floated in the zero-gravity void, breathing carefully from the emergency air tank he had found. Around him, the arena slowly returned to normal gravity and breathable air. When his feet touched solid ground again, Jake looked around to see who had survived the environmental trials. Only 4 champions remained standing. Jake could hardly believe he was one of them. Thrak the Destroyer had made it through using his incredible physical strength and natural toughness. Vex 9 had survived by adapting his mechanical body to each environment. Whisper of Death had used her mental powers to protect herself from the worst effects of each challenge. The crowd in the arena seats had grown quiet. Jake could feel thousands of alien eyes watching him with new interest. The betting odds that the shuttle pilot had mentioned were probably changing rapidly. The weak human was not supposed to still be here. "Congratulations to our surviving champions," announced the lead council member. "You have proven your ability to adapt and survive in hostile environments. Tomorrow you will face the trial of minds. Rest well tonight, for this next challenge will test your intelligence and problem-solving abilities rather than your physical endurance." Jake walked slowly back to his quarters, his body aching from the day's trials. Every muscle hurt and his throat was still raw from breathing toxic fumes and holding his breath in the void. But he was alive, and that was more than 8 other champions could say. In his room, Jake found a meal waiting for him on the desk. The food looked strange but smelled good. A note written in English explained that the meal was designed to help his body recover from the environmental stresses he had endured. Jake ate gratefully, wondering who had been thoughtful enough to provide food specifically prepared for human biology. That night, Jake lay in bed thinking about the trial of minds. The rules book had been vague about what this trial would involve, mentioning only that champions would face puzzles and challenges that tested intelligence, creativity, and strategic thinking. Jake had always been good at solving problems, but he wondered if his human way of thinking would be enough against beings who might have thousands of years of advanced education. The next morning, Jake woke early and spent time reviewing everything he could remember about logic puzzles, mathematics, and strategy games. He thought about chess matches with his father, crossword puzzles with his wife Kate, and the creative games he played with his daughter Emma. Human minds worked differently than alien minds, but Jake hoped that difference might be an advantage rather than a weakness. Jake entered the arena to find it transformed once again. The floor was now covered with a massive 3-dimensional maze that stretched up toward the ceiling in impossible spirals and loops. The maze walls were made of some kind of clear crystal, allowing Jake to see the complex structure but not understand how to navigate it. "Champions," called the council leader. "The trial of minds requires you to reach the center of the maze. Along the way, you will encounter puzzles, riddles, and challenges that must be solved to proceed. The maze will change and adapt based on your choices. Use your intelligence wisely, for brute force will not help you here." Jake approached the maze entrance along with the 3 other surviving champions. Up close, he could see that the crystal walls were covered with symbols, numbers, and patterns that seemed to shift and change as he watched them. Thrak the Destroyer entered the maze first, his military training taking over. He moved in straight lines when possible, and tried to force his way through barriers when the path was blocked. Jake could see the big warrior getting frustrated as his usual tactics failed against challenges that required thinking rather than fighting. Vex 9 approached the maze like a computer program, analyzing each puzzle with mathematical precision. His mechanical mind processed information quickly, but Jake noticed that the robot champion seemed to struggle with puzzles that required creative or intuitive thinking rather than pure logic. Whisper of Death glided into the maze with confidence, probably using her mental powers to sense the thoughts of whoever had designed the challenges. But even she seemed to slow down when faced with puzzles that required understanding of concepts her species had never encountered. Jake entered the maze last, taking time to study the first challenge before attempting to solve it. The entrance was blocked by a wall covered with musical notes. At first, Jake thought it was some kind of mathematical sequence, but then he recognized the pattern. It was not mathematics at all, but a simple children's song from Earth. Jake hummed the melody, and the wall dissolved away. The maze had somehow accessed information about human culture and was testing whether Jake could recognize his own species' creations. It was an interesting start, and Jake wondered what other surprises waited ahead. The next challenge was a three-dimensional puzzle box floating in the center of a large chamber. The box was covered with sliding panels, rotating rings, and buttons that lit up in different colors. Other champions might see it as a complex mechanical device, but to Jake it looked like every puzzle toy he had ever played with as a child, just bigger and more complicated. Jake approached the puzzle box and began manipulating the controls. Instead of trying to solve it through logic alone, he let his hands move intuitively, the way he had learned to solve similar puzzles through play rather than study. Within minutes, the box opened to reveal a key that unlocked the next section of the maze. As Jake progressed deeper into the maze, he began to understand something important. The challenges were not just testing intelligence in the way that aliens understood it. They were testing different types of thinking, different approaches to problem solving that various species might use. Jake found puzzles that required emotional understanding rather than logic. He solved riddles that needed humor and wordplay instead of mathematical precision. He navigated challenges that demanded intuitive leaps rather than careful analysis. These were exactly the kinds of problems that human minds were designed to handle. Humans had evolved to be flexible thinkers, able to combine logic with emotion, analysis with creativity, careful planning with sudden inspiration. Jake was in his element for the first time since the trials began. Behind him, Jake could hear the other champions struggling with challenges that did not fit their species' traditional ways of thinking. The maze was teaching all of them something important about the nature of intelligence itself. Jake reached the center of the maze first, which surprised him more than anyone else in the arena. The other three champions arrived within minutes of each other, all looking confused and frustrated. They had expected their advanced abilities to give them easy victories, but the maze had challenged them in ways they were not prepared for. At the center of the maze stood a circular platform with 4 pedestals arranged around a glowing crystal formation. The crystal pulsed with different colors, and Jake could hear a low humming sound coming from somewhere deep inside it. "Champions," came the voice of the council leader, though Jake could not see where the sound was coming from. "You have each proven your individual intelligence and problem-solving abilities. Now comes the final test, one that will determine not just who wins these trials, but something far more important." The crystal formation began to change, growing taller and more complex. New sections appeared that looked like control panels, each one clearly designed for a different type of being. One panel had buttons sized for Thrax's large claws. Another had interfaces that Vex 9's mechanical hands could operate. A third seemed designed for Whisper of Death's mental abilities. "This is the heart of Korvax," the voice continued. "It is older than our civilization, older than any civilization currently in the galaxy. It was left here by beings who came before us, along with instructions that we have spent 1,000 years trying to understand." Jake stepped closer to the crystal and saw that there was indeed a 4th control panel, one that looked like it was made for human hands. The discovery sent a chill down his spine. How could something older than galactic civilization have a Control panel designed for humans? The trials were never about finding the strongest fighter or the smartest individual, the voice explained. They were about finding representatives of species who could work together to operate this device. For 1,000 years, no group of champions has been able to make it function. Perhaps today will be different. Thrak the Destroyer snorted with disgust. I did not come here to work with others. I came to prove the superiority of the Saurian Empire. Stand aside and I will operate this device myself. The large warrior approached his control panel and began pressing buttons with his typical aggressive style. The crystal responded by flashing red lights and making angry buzzing sounds. Thrak pressed harder and faster, but the device only became more agitated. Vex 9 moved to his own panel and began running systematic tests on each control. His mechanical precision was impressive, but the crystal seemed to reject his purely logical approach. No matter how perfectly Vex 9 operated his controls, the device remained inactive. Whisper of Death placed her translucent hands on her panel and closed her eyes. Jake felt the mental pressure as she tried to force the device to work through pure, psychic power. The crystal glowed brightly for a moment, but then the light faded and the humming stopped completely. Jake watched his fellow champions struggle with their individual approaches and began to understand what the device required. He had seen something similar during his years as a ship captain, when his crew had to work together to solve problems that no single person could handle alone. This is not about domination or individual excellence, Jake said quietly. It is about cooperation. Thrak turned to glare at him. Cooperation is weakness. Only the strong deserve to control such power. If that were true, Jake replied, then you would have activated it already. But you have not, because this device was designed to require multiple perspectives working together. Jake approached his control panel and studied it carefully. The controls were indeed designed for human hands, but they were only one part of a larger system. Each panel controlled different aspects of the device, and they all needed to work in harmony. Vex 9, Jake called to the mechanical champion. Your panel controls the logical sequences. Whisper of Death, yours handles the energy flows. Thrak, yours manages the power output. Mine coordinates the timing between all of them. Why should we listen to the weak human? Thrak demanded. Jake looked around at the three alien champions. Because for the past 2 days, this weak human has survived everything the arena threw at us. Not through superior strength or advanced technology, but by adapting and learning and working with what was available. Whisper of Death studied Jake with her strange, glowing eyes. You believe this device requires our different abilities working together? I know it does, Jake said, with conviction. Look at the design. Each panel is specialized for what our species do best. Saurians are natural warriors with incredible physical power. Mechanoids excel at logical analysis and systematic thinking. Ethereals understand energy and mental forces in ways the rest of us cannot. And humans? What do humans do best? Vex 9 asked with genuine curiosity. Jake smiled. We bring different types of thinking together. We cooperate with beings who are different from us. We adapt and find ways to make things work, even when they should not. For a long moment, the four champions stood in silence. Jake could feel the weight of thousands of years of galactic history pressing down on them. The arena audience had gone completely quiet, sensing that something important was happening. Whisper of Death was the first to move. She placed her hands on her control panel and looked at Jake. Tell me what you need. Vex 9 stepped to his station. I am ready to follow your coordination. All eyes turned to Thrak. The massive warrior struggled with his pride, his natural instinct to dominate rather than cooperate. But finally, he moved to his panel with a frustrated growl. If this fails, human, I will hold you responsible. Jake took his position at the central control panel. If this fails, we all share the responsibility. If it succeeds, we all share the victory. Working together, following Jake's coordination, the four champions began to operate the heart of Korvax. The ancient device responded with growing enthusiasm, its crystal core brightening with each successful sequence. Energy flowed through patterns that no single species could have understood alone. When the device fully activated, it revealed its true purpose. The heart of Korvax was a communication system designed to unite different civilizations against cosmic threats that no single species could face alone. It had been waiting for 1,000 years for representatives who could demonstrate the cooperation necessary to defend the galaxy. Jake had walked into the arena alone, but he left it as part of something much larger. Humanity had earned its place among the stars not through conquest or superiority, but through the simple human ability to bring out the best in others and forge unity from diversity.